Hello again, welcome to an emergency edition of On the Whistle, coming to you from my very humble abode. As you can see, a very dramatic day on Wearside, I think it's fair to say. For those of you that haven't seen, although I suspect if you're watching this that you know pretty well and have read basically everything there is to read about it, but Michael Beale has left the club earlier today, something confirming that Mike Dodds will be going back to his previous role as interim manager until the end of the season. So yeah, I put a call out earlier today to see if there was any questions, anything people wanted to talk about on the back of today's news, and I got loads of questions. So thanks so much for sending them in. Sorry, I haven't got the most professional of setups for you here, but I'm sure you can understand. It's been quite a long day, and I'm sure you can also understand if I fumble over my words a little bit because it's been a hectic one. So we're going to get straight into it. Actually, first question comes from Peter, who actually asked on the story, who knew what when. So yeah, really interesting question. I'll take you behind the curtain as much as I possibly can. Obviously, there was a fair amount of rumours sort of over the weekend off the back of the Birmingham game, heading into sort of Sunday and Sunday evening. That was mainly based off the fact that Beale obviously didn't travel home with the team. I think he was seen, wasn't he, getting a flight back to Scotland. So obviously you sort of do your checks then and just see if there's anything happening. Our very strong understanding, which I completely sort of stand by and still believe now, was that was pre-planned. Obviously he was just going home to spend some time with his family. The players wouldn't have been necessarily been on a Sunday anyway, so there was nothing to it at that stage. Sometimes probably the thing that might surprise people sort of externally, and sometimes still takes me by surprise, is how quickly these things actually develop. So I genuinely don't think this decision had been taken finally until this morning. Obviously, not a lot of people are aware of it at that stage, and we certainly weren't. That began to change around lunchtime, and I think you've probably saw rumours on social media as well, just because obviously it all gets basically sorted and agreed, the terms and what have you, and then it's at that point that people start to get told about it, and decisions are sort of made following on from the decision for the manager to go. So that was kind of how it accelerated, and then you just go through the usual process really of you make sure that you've spoken to numerous people. You would never ever just hear one thing and then do a story on it. You're trying to get as much of the context as you possibly can, and like I say, you speak to a number of people before you arrive at the decision that that you're comfortable that it's definitely correct, and that's when we sort of we at the Echo ran it. What I would say is that although the actual decision, as I say, escalated really quickly today, I think it has something that's been sort of in the balance for a while. I think if you remember back before Stoke City, when results had been quite poor for a little while, Beale did a really kind of explosive press conference where he sort of said he wasn't getting the level of respect that his journey in the game deserved, suggested that a lot of the reason why fans didn't want him was because of where he was from, and he also basically said as well that it didn't matter what he did and what the results and performances are like, people would never take to him. My understanding was that went down pretty badly in terms of the actual club. And I think that Stoke game, I think there's a scenario where if it had gone slightly differently, there's a chance the decision would have been made then. Obviously, Beale oversaw a bit of uptick in results, and that gave him some more time. But I think off the back of the weekend, the situation obviously escalated, mainly because the results have been poor. But I also think there was an acceptance that maybe the trachea handshake thing kind of underlined whatever the rights and wrongs of it, whatever actually happened, that it was going to be really difficult for Beale to turn this around and win fans over. So I think that was definitely a factor in it, not actually what happened. I just think maybe it underlined to everyone that it wasn't going to work. And I think normally we all sort of say mutual consent, and we know that that's not really what happens. The manager gets sacked by the club. I do think while this was a club decision, I think it was genuinely a fairly two-way process. I think Michael Beale understood that it was going to be really difficult for him to be a success here off the back of everything that had gone on. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Peter, but hopefully it's given you a little bit of insight, and thanks very much for sending it in. What have we got next? Yeah, I've got one from James Dunlop, which I think the question kind of reflects what a few of you have been asking, so I'll kind of put this all in one category and hopefully it'll answer everyone's question. James says, with hindsight, is there anyone you think Kirill/Speakman would have preferred to hire instead of Beale in December? And how much might they struggle to appoint someone as a head coach rather than manager, especially given the striker recruitment scenario? I think this is a really, really good question. I think there's two aspects to it. So firstly, going back to December, I definitely think that Sunderland would have preferred to hire. I think they had a few candidates that they really liked, as well as Beale. Beale interviewed really well and they were genuinely enthusiastic, I think, about him, so that's important to stress. But there were a few candidates I think they liked, primarily from abroad. Will Still was very obviously one of them. What they found was that for financial reasons, logistic reasons, it was going to be really, really, really difficult to get them out of their clubs at that stage in the season. And that's why they went in a different direction. I do think that makes you question why they decided to get rid of Mowbray when they did. You know, should you have done your due diligence on the people you might want to hire and their availability beforehand? I would argue that maybe so. I'm sure the club would have their reasons for sort of why it panned out that way. But I definitely think that they would have preferred, or their first choice, I think, after the interview process was either Will Still or someone of that profile. Throwing it forward to the summer, I think there's two things to it. The kind of coach that they're looking to hire, probably someone younger, making their way in the game. I think everyone understands now that the days of the manager have gone, and I think that everybody understands, sort of going into head coaching roles, that you're not going to have the final say on recruitment. Or rather, I should say, you're not going to have a huge central role in recruitment. And I think actually most coaches are quite happy to work in that environment. I don't see that being a major issue. Where I think there probably is a question is around the fact that we know that Sunderland really want to keep as much as possible their coaching team in place. And I know that there have been some candidates in the past who've been a bit unsure because they want to bring their own staff with them. I can see both sides of the argument. I can see the club argument that you want stability and continuity, particularly if you want to implement a playing style that will last for a long time, then you need to keep some of the coaching staff to keep those messages the same. You can also understand anyone coming into the job wanting to bring some of their own staff with them, and I do think Beale maybe suffered from not having someone he trusted who he could lean on. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question a little bit. I do think Sunderland will be an attractive job in the summer. I genuinely think that the calibre of player that's here now and that tends to get recruited will really appeal to somebody. But I think there are definitely some things to ponder. And the stability, the lack of stability, I should say, a big difference this season is definitely something that Sunderland will work to correct, because they've done so much work to get rid of this image of chaotic Sunderland in disorder, a place with a really clear strategy, real stability, and a really sort of settled place to work. And I think it's going to be a bit of a task to get that back. So it's just something to think about going forward. Got a question here from Chris, which I thought was a really interesting question, one I wanted to talk about, which says, do the club need to consider fan sentiment when looking for the next head coach? Beale was bad, but his appointment brought negativity from the start. Really, really like this question because I think it's a really interesting point. One of the things that Sunderland sort of stressed when they appointed Beale, even though he was quite unpopular with the supporters, was that, well, Tony Mowbray wasn't universally popular when we appointed him. Alex Neil wasn't universally popular when we appointed him, and people broadly, including myself, I should add, were really keen to see Roy Keane come back. And they sort of said, look, you know, you've got to trust our processes, all the information we have, the interview processes we do, and so far it's worked out really well. And I think that's largely fair. What I do think this episode has shown that even in the new era where managers aren't all powerful in charge of recruitment, it's not just about coaching. The role of Sunderland now head coach rather than manager is such an important one, because it's such a club of such a big size and of such intensity that leadership skills, communication skills in particular, being able to build a rapport with the supporters, being able to explain to them directly what's going on, but without getting too high or too low, as us journalists and fans all get too high and too low at times, if we're honest. I think that's such an important quality. Tony Mowbray was really good at it. Alex Neil was excellent at it. Going even further back to people like Sam Allardyce, their mood would pretty much be exactly the same whether you won or lost. And they also had such an easy way of speaking to fans. And that's something that Sunderland need to consider, I think. It's not about appointing someone who's popular with the fans, but it's about understanding that, in my view, getting someone who you think is going to communicate well with the supporters and has those really strong communication skills actually helps you, because it helps you explain to supporters what you're doing, why you're making certain decisions, and that way you can get a buy-in that otherwise you can struggle with, I think. So while I don't necessarily agree that fan sentiment should be considered, I do think communication skills and sort of leadership skills, public facing skills, I do think that should be a massive part of the thinking going forward, and I hope that's something to take into consideration, because personally I think they underestimated that side of the job with Michael Beale. So thanks very much for your question, Chris. Okay, I've got a couple now, Tony and John, both basically asking very similar questions, which is along the lines of, is giving it to Mike Dodds until the end of the season essentially accepting that Sunderland aren't going to go up this season. I think there's two aspects to this. One is they genuinely really like Mike Dodds and really rate him, and he very, very nearly got given the job on an interim basis until the end of the season after Mowbray left, and as I discussed, their first target wasn't there. They just felt it was a little bit soon for him, I think. So I'm going to be fair and say they know he's popular with the players, which he is. They know he's won a bit of popularity with the fans because he did a good job last time. I think they do genuinely believe he gives them as good a chance as anyone, and certainly an improved chance of making it into the playoffs. What I would say is that all the challenges I spoke about in my second answer in terms of getting their preferred candidate during the season, all of those still apply now. So 2 months on, it wasn't going to be any easier to hire any of these other options that I talked about. So I think it's a little bit twofold. I don't think it's an acceptance that the season is over, but I do think it's an acceptance that the calibre or the kind of candidate they want is likely going to have to be come in the summer. So yeah, hopefully that answers that a little bit. Let's see what else we have got. Yes, this is one from my colleague James, who says, why is this football club not normal? Well, I wish I had the answer to that, other than I suppose there's something about us that all keeps us coming back for more. I think the one thing I would say, as I've just alluded to there, is that I think it's a club of real intensity, and you need someone who is really, really capable of managing those ups and downs. And as I mentioned, I think we've seen some of the managers who've done that really effectively in the last few years, and that's definitely something that we need to think about. So the last one is, given the failure in the interview process the last 2 times we've done it, Neil was the right man, but pretty clear Keane was the number 1 choice, and then Beale after. Do you have any faith we will get the right person, or is it better we have a number 1 choice and just go for them? Well, I think what I would say to that is, it's a really good question. I think that Alex Neil, probably was Christian Speakman's preferred choice. But what you've got to remember is that in a football club, there's lots of different opinions and lots of different views, and it's not necessarily always easy to come to one sort of uniform solution. There's a lot of conflicting voices. The other thing I would say is that my personal view is I'm not sure Michael Beale was necessarily the first choice after the interview process this time. I actually think that there were other candidates after the interview process, and Beale, who did interview well, was then turned to after maybe those candidates didn't arrive. So I'm not entirely sure it's the interview process itself. The 2 questions I would ask on the back of that is, one thing that I have wondered is, why didn't they have a better sense of potential candidates' availability before they did the interviews last time? I think that's a fair question. The second interview that I find slightly strange, aspect of the interview that I find slightly strange, is we've seen the style of play has kind of become a bit more defensive, a bit less open, a bit less exciting. Now, I can sort of understand the reasons for that, to try and improve someone's defence, but it totally goes against what the club have been saying about creating a really dynamic, front foot, exciting style of play. It really makes me interested as to what was sort of discussed about identity and style of play in the interview process. That's a really interesting question that hopefully I'll get the chance to ask at some point, because I think that's a fairly legitimate concern. So again, I hope that answers your question. I think generally Sunderland's talent ID, both in terms of players, staff and head coaches, has been pretty good so far. But this is obviously a huge misstep, and I think that, this appointment in the summer is going to be a huge one. So yeah, hopefully I've brought a bit of insight into the day and the decision and what comes next and all of that with this video. Thanks very much for sending your questions in. We'll be back on Saturday with another one after the... Crikey, who we play on Saturday? Swansea City at home. Sorry, it's been a long day. I think that, listen, I think this is the right decision for the club. I think the season's hanging on a knife edge a little bit, and I think it's vitally important that they get a string of results from the next few games, and I do think that Mike Dodds is probably pretty well placed to get a response from the players, especially for Saturday's game, which is huge. So yeah, fingers crossed, but I think it does clearly, it's the shortest tenure in managerial history. That can't all be about, at Sunderland I should say, that can't all be about just the manager themselves, can it? That has to ask questions to the people who made those decisions, and that's definitely going to be a big theme going forward in the coming weeks and months. So yeah, hope I've answered your questions. Thanks so much for sending them in. I'm really enjoying doing these because they're really fantastic questions, and I really enjoy getting my teeth stuck into them. And yeah, we'll be back at the weekend. Thanks for watching.